So what are they going to do? It's going to be a city building?
We think it would be, we don't know exactly, it'd be about 50,000. She's saying. So we went to the grant that to require we either buy the building and put ourselves.
Pardon me, can I sign in?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let's call this meeting to order. Commissioner Cazeta is excused and Commissioner Hart-Stebbins will be an alternate. Commissioner Talbert will participate by telephone. All other members are or will be present.
Thank you.
Let's start with a moment of silence, then the Pledge of Allegiance led by Commissioner Hart-Stebbins. Thank you, and thank you all for being here this evening. It looks like we have a really good crowd. So I would like to make one change in the agenda. We will be moving item 10A to the first agenda item this evening. This is a water report by Kirtland Air Force Base. It's an update of the water report. So we'd like to ask the presenters to come forward and give us your information. Please go ahead. Good evening.
Hey, good evening. I'm Mark Rell. For those who don't know me, I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Environment, Safety, and Infrastructure, deeply involved in the Kirtland bulk fuels cleanup for many years now. I just wanted to take a brief moment this evening to take the opportunity to let you know that we're making some minor tweaks or adjustments to the governance from the Air Force perspective of how we oversee the cleanup. Two things I wanted to advise you of tonight. First, there's been some concern in the community and the stakeholders in the past of who is the single voice of the Air Force when we're talking about the Kirtland bulk fuels cleanup. And that hasn't always been as clear to everyone as it probably needed to be and could create some confusion in the community and with our stakeholders. So tonight I'd like to let you know that I have worked with our Air Force Civil Engineer Center and the 377th Air Base Wing senior leadership, and we'll let you know that our long-serving, highly qualified expert, Ms. Kate Linus, who lives here and works here on this project, will be the single voice of the Air Force with regard to the cleanup. I don't want you to think that changes anything dramatically in terms of how we're doing anything or what we're doing, but we want to make it clear who's speaking for the Air Force. The Air Force Civil Engineer Center will continue in its role of doing the technical work associated with the cleanup, as well as interacting with our contractors and the New Mexico Environmental Department. The second thing I wanted to announce tonight was that we were going to make a change in how we do our public affairs work on the cleanup. In the past, the lead has been our Public Affairs Office from the Air Force Civil Engineer Center in San Antonio. We're going to now make that the Public Affairs Office of the 377th Air Base Wing here at Kirtland. We will have a dedicated public affairs person in the wing assigned to Ms. Linus to ensure that we are communicating directly to the community and stakeholders on the cleanup with folks who are in town, understand the dynamics of what's going on. The Civil Engineer Center will continue to provide PA reachback support to the folks here at Kirtland, but we will resource them to ensure that we have a good public affairs presence here and are able to communicate with everyone involved. And that's all I wanted to give you this evening, and I thank you for your time.
Good evening.
Good evening, Madam Chair. Let me scroll over to my slides. I am Dennis McQuillan. I'm the Chief Scientist with the New Mexico Environment Department, and I had been heavily involved in this for several years and then took a sabbatical to work on a little mishap that happened up in Colorado with a mine that polluted water in New Mexico, and I'm back on the project as the lead as of first week of January this year. And we're really pleased to be invited here tonight to explain to you the progress in our vision for 2018 as per our strategic plan, which has been issued as a draft for public comment. Comments are due on April 6th. So I don't know if the slide it kind of disappeared there for the audience, but the cover picture, for those of you who've been on our field trips, shows the geologic formation that comprises the aquifer below the Air Force Base. It's a coarse sand and gravel, and this is exposed in the lower Tijeras Arroyo. We'd be glad to conduct another field trip if anybody would like to see that. Can you get that to work? The second slide is the outline of our...
Why don't you give us just a second?
Sure.
Let's see if we can get this
Sure.
working. Thank you.
There we go.
Okay, thanks.
So this slide summarizes our strategic plan for 2018. This is not a regulatory document. We have all the regulatory documents posted on our website with all the engineering diagrams and the monitoring requirements and the data. This is our vision, NMED's vision for what we want to accomplish in 2018. The goal is the same. This is the fourth strategic plan that we put out. I've got the first three for 2015, 16, and 17 here, and we have a few extra copies if anybody would like to see it. There has been no substantial change in our strategy, and we've restructured some things, but the goal is the same: to protect the aquifer and to protect the drinking water supply wells. That is our primary goal. The first strategy is the same: to continue to implement robust monitoring and wellhead protection of the drinking water wells that are in the area of fuel spill. Strategy number two it had not been in the previous strategic plans, not as a strategy, but it's the same thing that has been mentioned in these strategic plans from the previous 3 years, where we want to look at what the bacteria in the soil and the groundwater are doing and look for opportunities for engineered solutions to enhance the natural attenuation or the biodegradation that they've done. These are the strategic plans for 2015, 16, 17. I put blue tabs on these plans where we made reference to the natural degradation in our efforts to wish to enhance what the bacteria are doing, basically to enable them to do a better job of biodegrading the pollution. Natural attenuation existed decades before the plume was discovered in 1999, and it's an industry standard to monitor what they're doing and then to look for opportunities for intervention with engineering technology to allow the bacteria to do a better job of that. And if anybody would like to see these, I have all the tabbed references. So we've pulled out this strategy of enabling the bacteria to do a better job from these other plans and elevated it to be a new strategy in the 2018 plan. That leads into strategy number 3, which is to continue to deploy multiple engineering solutions, technologies, simultaneously and sequentially, and I'll show you the history of what we've done, as interim corrective measures to clean up the soil and the groundwater. And we've made substantial progress, as I'll show you in just a minute, on the interim measures in cleaning up the soil in particular, and in the LNAPL, the light non-aqueous phase liquid. This is an abbreviated presentation for what I'll be presenting tomorrow night at our public meeting. We'll have more time. And the fourth strategy is the same as it's been previously. We want to meet or exceed all requirements for providing public outreach and information and involvement. So I'll go through very briefly the various strategies. The strategy number 1 is with regard to the monitoring. We have no detections of EDB in the Sentinel wells or in the drinking water wells. That's a very good thing. We've established a cone of depression, which is basically a lowering of the water table in the area where the extraction wells are. We have all 4 extraction wells running now as of February of this year. And we've just reconvened the modeling working group to do a rigorous capture zone analysis. This is different from the cone of depression. This will be an analysis that looks at what area the plume is being captured by the extraction wells. And I want to thank the water utility for hosting the kickoff meeting here in Albuquerque in January. And this is going to launch a process where there's going to be various models being run in peer review and look at exactly what the capture zone is for the 4 extraction wells that are pumping. Now, as you all know, the water table has been rising, and we are looking at what effects that water table rise is going to have on the direction the groundwater flows and the direction that contaminants are migrating in. There are data graphs that have been created by this rising water table. Wells that had previously been screened across the water table are now flooded. And so we don't have adequate monitoring on that uppermost part of the aquifer. And Scott is going to talk to you a little bit later tonight about what the Air Force is going to do. There's going to be 18 new monitoring points put in, and we're going to be looking at converting some previously dry soil vapor wells into groundwater monitoring wells.
Excuse me just a second. Will this bother you if we ask questions so we don't forget where we want to ask?
No.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Quinlan, I know we'll follow this up later, but can you just tell me a little bit? I understand that you say there's no detection of EDB in the drinking water wells or the Sentinel wells, but I also know that we've talked, and you just mentioned 85% of the wells we had have been drowned out. And so is it we're not detecting it because it's not there, or not detecting it because we don't have the sufficient monitoring wells and capability to do that work? This sounds like a very different strategy to me than what we did earlier when we said we need to drill new wells in order to get better data.
Well, that's a really good question, Madam Chair. The drinking water wells are monitored on a monthly basis. And when I say there's no detections in those drinking water wells, that's based on those data. The Sentinel wells are actually monitoring wells that are not used for drinking, and they're located between the contamination plume in the drinking water wells. Some of those have been flooded, and we need to replace them so we have really good. Now, the wells that were flooded are still useful. So instead of monitoring the water table zone, they're now monitoring a deeper zone within the aquifer. So they're still providing some data, but we need to replace that monitoring capability across the water table, because that's what the industry standard is in looking at various depths within the groundwater. Did that answer your question, sir?
For now, I think we'll come back to it.
Sure. So the Air Force and NMED remain committed to keeping contamination out of the drinking water wells. That was a commitment that was made several years ago, and we are steadfast in making sure that contamination does not happen. The next slide shows these 18 new monitoring points. These are the green squares. You can see the spread that we have around the plume, and Scott is going to be talking about that a little bit later. I won't spend a lot of time on the slide since Scott will be talking about it. We're also going to be coring the area where the oil exists in the soil and the groundwater. This is another data gap, and it'll be covered in the final strategic plan, but we're going to talk more tomorrow night about how that oil exists in the subsurface. It exists as, there are some parts of it that don't drain into wells. It's trapped in the soil by capillary forces, and it provides a long-term source of dissolved phase contamination. So this is a pretty significant data gap that will also be filled in 2018. So strategy 2 involves determining what the bacteria are doing in the way of biodegrading these contaminants and looking for ways where we can have engineering interventions to enable them to do a better job. And so we know that we have hydrocarbon oxidation in the soil and groundwater. This is a very common degradation reaction that occurs all over the world. We're also seeing within the area where the ethylene dibromide is commingled with the petroleum, it is undergoing a process called reductive debromination. Unfortunately, it only occurs in that area of commingling, and then it moves out beyond that area, and we have evidence that the EDB is undergoing hydrolysis, which is a chemical reaction where the EDB interacts with the water and gets degraded. So these are processes that we've identified, and we're looking particularly at the oxidation and the reductive debromination at ways that we can help the bacteria do a better job. The next slide gets to strategy 3 in deploying multiple engineering solutions to clean this up. The yellow symbols there are things that have been done already in the past and are completed or are ongoing. The removal, excavation of contaminated soil, the bioslurping, which recovered approximately 250,000 gallons of oil of LNAPL, and that was quite successful. We had 12 years of soil vapor extraction where we vacuumed fumes of fuel out of the soil, And for 2 3/4 years, we've had the groundwater extraction system, which is over at the distal end of the plume, closest to the Water Utility Authority drinking water wells. The red symbols are engineering solutions that will be deployed as pilot tests this year in 2018. Enhanced in situ anaerobic groundwater biodegradation, airlift biodegradation, bioventing, which is a logical follow-up, and I'll explain these in just a minute. But these all involve stimulating, augmenting, or enhancing the bacterial activity that's going on in the site. We are not proposing to walk away from this and do nothing and just let nature take its toll, take its course. We are looking at ways to facilitate the bacteria in the natural processes that they've been working under and have them do a better job of degrading the contamination. This is a common thing that's done in this industry. The next slide depicts the anaerobic biodegradation pilot test. This is a really promising project. We had laboratory tests where we took groundwater from the site and put in various amendments into them, like lactate and nutrients and actually proprietary bacteria, and based this field study on the results of the laboratory tests. So the Air Force, this is a project that's underway in generating data. We're going to be injecting amendments into the groundwater that's contaminated and seeing how the native bacteria respond to that. We have an injection well, some monitoring wells, and extraction wells, and we're setting up a cell where the groundwater will be treated. This will ultimately lead to the introduction of proprietary bacteria. You see in the next slide, D. halicocoides, which is a naturally occurring bacteria that has been shown to biodegrade ethylene dibromide. So this is some really cool science stuff going on here, and we're all watching this very, very closely. The biostimulation was completed. Now they're in the monitoring of that. The augmentation with proprietary bacteria will probably commence in May or June, and then they'll be monitoring that afterwards. We're hoping that one of these or more of these technologies that are being tested at the field scale, the pilot scale, will be promising to scale up to cleaning up the plume, the much larger plume. Bioventing is very simple. We know that the bacteria need oxygen to biodegrade the fuel contamination. We had 12 years of vacuuming. Now we're going to very gently blow oxygen and moisture into the soil to enable the soil bacteria to continue biodegrading the fuel and hopefully do it faster. The 12 years of vacuum extraction dehydrated the bacteria. They need some moisture, and we know they need oxygen. And this is a logical follow-up to the 12 years of vacuum extraction. Strategy 4 describes, and I think you've seen versions of this in previous years, the schedule for public outreach. The Air Force and NMET welcome any opportunities and invitations from anybody, basically, to come out and present what we're doing. And here's the timeline. This goes all the way back to day 1 when the plume was discovered. I wanted to point out on what's called the RCRA facility investigation that goes all the way into 2019. And this hasn't been made widely public yet, but we're going to have a phase 1 that concludes with all the data through December of 2015, and then a phase 2 that will include all the work that's being done from this point forward in the last year, 2 years, as a phase 2 RFI, or RCRA facility investigation report. So the investigation's not over. Unfortunately, we had the rising water table created data gaps. It's going to delay us a little bit in getting to the next step, which is the corrective measures evaluation, which will require a public hearing, and that process will begin the selection of the final remedy for the site. But in the meantime, you can see the interim corrective actions that are underway for 2018. These engineered solutions are being put in place. The monitoring is ongoing, and our commitment to protect the drinking water wells of the VA, the Air Force Base, the VA Hospital, the Air Force Base, and the water utility remains steadfast. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Commissioner Hart-Stebbins, do you have some questions?
I would have some questions. Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. Thank you, Dennis, for being here. Really appreciate your presentation tonight. I have a question. You know, clearly there's a change in the focus on natural attenuation. I mean, I almost feel like we're back to 2009 where CH2M Hill was recommending that as the only strategy. So I'm curious what is what evidence is bringing you back to that as a solution?
I'm really glad, Madam Chair and Commissioner Stebbins, that you asked that question. We are not proposing natural attenuation as a corrective action at this point. We've been monitoring natural attenuation for many, many years, almost 2 decades, because this is an industry standard. We want to know what the bacteria are doing to the plume. And we have many, many years of data, and I'll present some of that tomorrow night, on the degradation products, the reactions that are occurring. And this is going to spring us, hopefully springboard us into selecting options for enhanced bioremediation, which is an active engineered remedy that involves taking greater advantage of what the bacteria do naturally. So neither the Air Force nor the Environment Department are proposing monitored natural attenuation as a remedy. We monitor this as a matter of routine practice. It's an industry standard, and we've been doing this for a long time, so there is really no shift in our strategy or our policy on that.
Okay, so this is a step in the characterization.
Yes, ma'am. We've been monitoring the natural attenuation for a long time, looking at the bicarbonate, the generation of iron that's released from the soil, depletion of oxygen and nitrate as the bacteria consume these, looking at the byproducts and looking at the carbon isotopes as well as they get fractionated by these processes. So we've been monitoring these natural attenuation parameters for a long time.
But not as a remedy, but as informing what the final remedy will be.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Because on one of your slides, you show EDB hydrolysis.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yes, this is not a biological process, unlike the hydrocarbon oxidation and the reductive debromination. This is a process where the EDB reacts with the water itself, or the hydroxyl ions, and the OH and so on, and is actually degraded under a chemical process, not a biological process. There was a paper that one of our team members presented at the Patel, it's an international conference a couple years ago, and I believe he has a journal article on this as well. It's one of the comments we had from Dr. John Wilson, who's written all these guidebooks, and he's the godfather of a lot of this, is that he thought that Murphy's Law sometimes works in our favor, that if anything escaped the pump and treat system, we have half a mile between the plume and your drinking water wells where hydrolysis is active. And so it's another level of, it's certainly not as aggressive as an engineered solution, but it's happening, and we want to monitor that and see just how much EDB is degrading. All these processes have been going on for decades, even before we discovered it, and we want to know the magnitude, the rates. There's a lot of work to be done on that. And particularly, we want to know how we can speed these reactions up, if that's possible.
Okay, so that again is not being considered as a final remedy or part of the remediation. It's just a way of measuring what's already taken place.
At this time, right.
Okay.
We can't really talk about the final remedy because we have to have a very
Right.
robust public hearing
Right.
after the CME, the
Good
corrective
point.
measures evaluation.
Because I guess my question is, how long has it been since EDB was present in jet fuel? It's been 35, 40 years?
Madam Chair, Commissioner, 1975
Okay.
is when it was
So
discontinued.
if that process were having a significant impact, we wouldn't see the levels of EDB in our groundwater.
It's clearly not destroying the whole plume, but we have evidence that it's destroying part of it. And we want to know exactly how much, what those reaction rates are, and figure this into the whole conceptual site model, and ultimately into the final remedy, which will involve, hopefully, a lot of bioremediation. You know, these processes that occur naturally with no human intervention, we want to speed those up. The groundwater pump and treat is something that doesn't involve bioremediation. That's just a physical removal.
Right.
And we've recovered more than 350 million gallons of groundwater, purified it to less than detectable levels, and used it either for the golf course or injected it. And that's a lot of water that we've protected.
And so the enhanced attenuation, has that been tested outside the lab? Has that been tested in the field?
It has. and it hasn't been tested at this depth in the challenging conditions we have here. The airlift is a technology that guidance documents have been written on. We actually have some of the people who wrote those guidance documents working in the team. The Air Force has brought in some of the intellectual firepower. Bioventing is well established. You know, we give those bacteria oxygen in the soil, and we know exactly what to do. Now, the enhanced bioremediation is some cutting edge stuff. And this is a perfect site to do this on. You know, the Air Force got some research money from some other budget to do this, and we have two of the foremost microbiologists in the world working on this. And we're going to, Tara Kunkel with Aptum is going to present a more detailed discussion of this tomorrow night. And I can tell you, of course, I'm a geek scientist, but this stuff is really cool. If this D. halicocoides bacteria, which does not exist at the site, we have other bacteria that we know dehalogenate compounds, but this one right here has an appetite, if you will, for ethylene dibromide, and that will be injected into the groundwater in about May or June. So stay tuned. We have some really exciting science going on here.
That's great. Well, it's certainly optimistic that that will contribute to the solution here. Let me ask you a question. Under Strategy 1, you referred to zone capture analysis. And I'm not quite sure how that relates to the plume capture model that has been referenced in the notice of deficiency, but tell me what the process is as you see this going forward for doing a more complete analysis of the capture zone from the pump and treat system.
Sure. And again, thanks for that question. The Air Force has been submitting capture zone analyses in their quarterly reports, but we don't believe they're robust enough. They provide some level of information, but the EPA, the federal EPA, has put out a guidance document with a 6-step process on how to do this correctly. And we just reconvened the modeling working group, and again, thanks to the Water Utility for hosting that meeting at their office here. And so we're going to have some really high caliber modelers working on this. I know John Sigda, Dr. Sigda with Intera is going to be working for the Water Utility. The gentleman who's with EPA will be working on that. And the USGS, US Geological Survey is involved. And of course the Air Force contractors. So there may be multiple models, which is a good thing. We've presented, we had John present at one of our public meetings. We've had some of the modeling results. So having different modeling codes used is a good thing, and see if they come up with the same results. We're going to try and use the same assumptions for the hydraulic properties and eliminate that as a variable, and use the same, we're going to use the drinking water standard as to map these things. So to the extent we can be consistent and compare apples with apples, we're going to do that. So the next meeting is on April 12th, and the modelers are going to all get together, and the top priority for this modeling group is to produce one or more models that rigorously conform to the EPA guidelines, and using the data from the site, the 4 extraction wells which are pumping water level data, and make predictions on plume capture and analyses of how much we're capturing.
Well, thank you for that, because that clearly has been a concern for me, and I think others at the Water Authority, the difference between the notice of deficiency letter on November 16th that was quite detailed about your expectation for the plume capture model, that then in the recent March 6th letter seemed to sort of back off. I mean, I'm wondering what your thought process or what the Environment Department's process was moving from that November 16th position to March 6th.
Well, the Air Force is committed to producing preliminary modeling results by March 31st, and they will carry those results into the April 12th meeting. We don't want to see a final report from the Air Force until the modeling group gets a little further along. It's just, we want substantial peer review on this. We want the modelers to talk to each other and share input parameters and do calibration with water level data. We also just got the 4th extraction well up and running in February. And so we need to see how the system responds to that. We can measure the cone of depression. That, as you all know, is different from the capture zone. So we're going to push that back a little bit because we want a really high quality peer-reviewed product coming from the working group, not just from the Air Force.
So that'll include input from the Water Authority, the City of Albuquerque, NMED, Air Force, the
Yes.
stakeholders in this group. Let me ask you about the wells, because this relates to the capture model, the plume capture model. I know that Anterra's model has assumed that those wells are functioning 24/7. But I saw a document recently that said that they're really operating on about 50% of the time. How does that affect the plume capture model that was in the RFI that Anterra has produced?
Well, the new model effort will take that into account, and not just how often they pump it, how many gallons per minute. The well that was just put online, extraction well 239, is pumping around 75 gallons a minute, while the others are pumping approximately 150. And that's because it's closer to the source, and we don't want to pull things in too fast. The treatment system can handle petroleum hydrocarbons up to a certain point. And we have established in our permits influent limits. The influent cannot exceed 450 of benzene, or something has to be done. So the system is really well engineered. It can handle some amount of petroleum as well as the ethylene dibromide. The effluent limits are the drinking water standards, so they're more stringent of state groundwater standards and drinking water standards. We monitor upstream from the carbon unit, between the two units, and the effluent. And there's two streams that are operating in parallel. So we have really good monitoring on that and safeguards. If we start seeing the contamination rise, that'll be closely monitored. There may be wellhead samples taken at 239. But these wells were selected with a lot of peer review in the water utility, the city health department, the state, the Air Force, USGS, and we put our best effort forward to put these pins on the map. And there's a lot of modeling support that went into that. And we're very grateful of the participation by the water utility in that modeling effort, and in the collaboration in coming up with this interim measure that so far has purified 350 million gallons of groundwater. I think we all should be high-fiving each other right now on this.
That is certainly something to celebrate. And I'm sorry, I don't want to take up all of your time, but just on that fourth well, so it is closer to the source area. So if it begins to draw in a significant amount of BTEX, then what happens? I mean, is it permitted for remediating those chemicals?
They can't exceed 500 micrograms per liter of benzene, because that will make the Air Force a hazardous waste generator. Right. So that's the number we've established a limit of 450 as a safety factor for going into the treatment plant. Now, if we start, and we probably will eventually see levels of EDB creep up, we'll probably see some BTEX come in. If the levels start approaching that, they'll start pumping the well fewer hours per day. These are great questions, and the modeler is going to be looking at the extraction wells and how many hours a day they pump, how many gallons per minute they pump. They're going to be looking at the production wells, how much they produce. You know, the complicating factor is because of the exemplary water conservation practices by your customers and the use of river water, that the water table's been rising and the Kona Depression up by the Ridgecrest well field has been filling in. This is fantastic for the sustainability of your aquifer, but it creates complications and data gaps for us, and we know how to fill data gaps, and we have some of the top scientists around working on this. So,
great. And one last question. I know Councilor Davis is waiting. In the notice of deficiencies, there was a reference to the coring plan. Can you give us an update where you are with that?
Yes. The coring plan was given conditional approval late February, early March. They'll be mobilizing the drill rigs sometime later this year, and we hope to gain a lot more information about where that LNAPL is, because I think, as you guys know, you're a pretty educated board, you can have LNAPL in the soil, which does not flow into a well, and that's trapped there by capillary forces. Like if you have a cup of coffee and you stick a handkerchief in there, that coffee gets sucked up into the napkin, into the handkerchief, but in the cloth. That's capillary forces. So the problem with that residual LNAPL is it provides a long-term source of dissolved phase contamination, and that's one of the more prominent data gaps. So the Air Force complied with that requirement in the NOD, and that approval letter has gone out. The water utility, the technical people were copied on that letter. It's posted on the Haz Waste website. And that some of those core holes will be completed as groundwater wells to fill data
Great.
gaps.
So in about 2016, I think the technical working group came to a consensus about what that coring plan would look like. Are the specifics of that recommendation, are those included in the bid package that has gone out to execute this?
Madam Chair, Commissioner, we had to impose some conditions on that. I don't have the letter in front of me, but we imposed conditions on that approval letter, particularly in the background and doing mineralogical work. And I think it reflects the best plan forward on coring in that zone where we expect residual Elnapple. We're going to begin the coring 10 feet above where the water was at in 1970 and go down below where it's at today.
So from the NMED position, your expectation is that the Air Force, when it gets a contractor to do this, that the contractor will be asked to meet the standards agreed to in 2016 by the technical working group?
I believe so. I mean, I don't have those recommendations in front of me, but we went back and forth on this. You know, the other thing to keep in mind is that these are all data-driven, and it may take more than one drilling program to fill the data gaps on the Elnapple, and it may take more than one drilling campaign to fill the data gaps in the rising water table. We always have that option. We do some work, get the data, and see if it satisfies our needs, and we can require more on that.
Okay, and a deadline for that, for the coring work to be done?
Maybe the Air Force can talk more about the.
Okay, I can ask. I know
rigs
they'll be coming
are
up. Again, I've taken up enough time. May I submit additional questions in writing?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Hartstevis. Councilor Davis, do you have some questions?
Very briefly, Mr. Quinlan, thank you so much for being here, and I do appreciate that. I do not have the technical expertise that Commissioner Hartstevis does, but I wanted to follow up on a couple of sort of big picture pieces here and be sure that we can go back and explain to the public, and that I think that y'all are prepared to explain to the public sort of these, because I think this is a pretty dramatic shift in our strategy, at least in the way the proposed plan would allow for redefining sort of what we're looking for here. It appears concerning on its face that there's nothing in the new plan that directly addresses a continuing active remediation, and it seems very much like the big picture starts to be, and I hear this, that we're moving more towards the passive natural attenuation and monitoring and enhancing those pieces, which have been working. And I think there's early data to suggest, and I support expanding the data, and if we get good science out of it, that works. But are we continuing to do pump and treat on the actual source? And what other, let's start there to be clear. Are we continuing to do pump and treat while the Air Force is examining and the permittee is looking at new science?
Absolutely. That'll be going on for many years. And I don't think that is, and maybe because we've abbreviated this plan, we are not moving towards passive remediation. Neither the Air Force nor NMED are proposing monitored natural attenuation as a corrective measure. The Strategy 3, you can see there's all types of engineered remediation solutions that have been done, that are ongoing, and that are going to be pilot tested this year. So we are very aggressively pursuing active remediation with engineered solutions. Those three options in red will be implemented this year, and hopefully one or all three of them will be promising enough that we can develop it at a more elaborate scale.
And I think I want to go back, and I do want to go back to Commissioner Hartstevis' question, because I think it's important to hit at. I think these strategies, and obviously some of the vapor extraction, as you mentioned, has sort of starved some of the bacteria. These new strategies that have been looking at have been enhancing the oxygen and allowing them to do that faster. But the levels that we continue to see, or that we originally found, are from, quite frankly, from Air Force jet fuel older than me. And so the natural strategies haven't been working, and it would take, it seems, based on the data we see so far, a pretty sophisticated and big change in our strategy overall to address the extended concerns, especially with the Elnapple. Does NMED confident that this multiple strategies more natural strategies will combine to give us a result and an answer more quickly than the strategies we're using now?
Well, Madam Chair, Commissioner, that's a great question. You know, our strategy has been to go out and do these tests at a small scale and see if it works. Some work better than others. And we hope that we do enough of this, that by the time that we get to the corrective measures evaluation, we'll have enough options on the table that we can put together a final remedy. And we want to take full advantage of these natural processes. That's an industry standard. Bioremediation is a very hot subject right now because it can work under the right conditions. And we have corrective actions, like you mentioned, the pump and treat, that's going to be going on for many years. That's not a biological process, that's a physical. But it's getting the most dangerous part of the EDB, the EDB that's closest to your wells. And the community demanded that of us in the Air Force, and we did it. Now we're going to be looking at the source area where the highest concentrations are in most of the mass. And so we're attacking this plume with different technologies at different locations simultaneously and sequentially. And hopefully all this information is going to inform the process of what the final remedy is going to be.
And I appreciate that very much, Mr. Quillen. I think that's right, and we do ultimately want to get to that place. And I know the timeline, I think the timeline shouldn't guide our work here. Obviously, it's an important checkpoint, but being sure we get it right. I think the notice of deficiency also, in using NMED's words from their March 6th letter, correctly noted that the notice of deficiency expressed concern that the permittee's evaluation of contaminant concentration likely overstated the amount of contaminant degradation. And it appears to me that both the Air Force and NMED agree that they now agree in that point. But there are some other places in earlier data that some of the data, it appears the parties had agreed was perhaps insufficient, and that some of that may be guiding this new analysis. For example, I think as you rightly noted, hydrolysis is occurring there, but the RCRA facility investigation report, and I'm just going to reference some of the notes in this, included an analysis of isotope analysis from 2013 data that NMED and the Air Force later agreed had quality issues and wasn't usable data. And so does NMED have a different data set by which we can measure progress now, or are we essentially starting over again on data? Do we have the adequate right data to determine whether these new processes are helping, hindering, or just keeping us in status quo?
Yes, and again, I'm glad you asked that question. Both the 2013 isotope data and the slug test data were determined to be, by NMED, to be unreliable. Now, we've included that, we reference these for the sake of transparency. We don't want to be accused of hiding something because it wasn't done right. It's just part of the administrative record. And it's unfortunate that these tests were not done properly. With regard to the isotope data, there was a new set of data that was done in 2015. And this is the data set that Dr. Koester van Gross is using to draw the conclusions about the hydrolysis, and it's referenced in his paper. The slug tests are being replaced by other tests, and for the sake of transparency, we're going to acknowledge that these data exist, but we have not changed our position at NMED that these data were unreliable to begin with.
Thank you, Mr. Quillen. And Madam Chair, one final question to follow. And you're here, and thank you for your NMED's chief scientist. I think that says a lot about your credentials, and you've shown that tonight with us and through this work. But this project, as my understanding, has been moved out of the old Hazardous Waste Bureau to the Secretary's office to be managed there. Is that correct?
That's a really interesting question. We have the Haz Waste Bureau has the permit has been issued by the Haz Waste Bureau. The Groundwater Bureau has issued the groundwater permit for the injection well, and I am working closely with the Groundwater Bureau and the Haz Waste Bureau and the Office of the Secretary to coordinate all this. So we have multiple jurisdictions within the Environment Department on that.
But I just want to be certain that the original sort of technical experts, the scientists particularly in Hazardous Waste Bureau that were doing this analysis and work with our staff and with the Air Force along the way, do they still have daily access to the data and the plan and the planning meetings in developing this, or is this a project that's now led sort of in your office without their daily sort of interaction that they used to have?
We have a technical team that consists of myself a technical person with the Hazardous Waste Bureau, a technical person with the Groundwater Bureau, and a technical person with the Drinking Water Bureau, and a technical person with the Petroleum Storage Tank Bureau, because they deal with these contaminants on a day-to-day basis. So the Secretary Tongate has assembled this interdisciplinary team of mostly senior people, and we call in the drinking water people when we need to. We're going to be revisiting the source water protection plan for the VA hospital, blowing the dust off that and updating that and making sure that we're all confident that that well that serves the hospital will be protected. So in the data are out there, there's just reams of data. It's posted on our website. If you want to get into information overload, just go to the Hazardous Waste website and you can access all the reports and the maps and the data tables and the work plans and the approval letters.
Thank you, Mr. Quinlan. And just to characterize, I think the concern is, and I appreciate that, I think the concern, and I want to pass it off to my colleague, if it's okay with the chair, but the concern, I think, is that the new plan seems, as you said, it's more simplified. And I think the concern is we were doing really well in 2016, 17, and by adding some opportunities to look at new science, that seems great, but it seems more that that should be an expanded plan, not a more simplified one. And I think the concern from the community will be that we just got on the right track. How do we ensure that the new plan continues to require all the things that we had finally gotten to that were showing progress and working, and still allows for the external extra data and analysis and new science that might one day get better? I think it's concerning that it appears that we're pulling back from the progress we'd made in order to allow for new things instead of expanding and being sure that we're continuing on the good path while we're looking for new options to maybe speed that up. How do we address that concern that this might be too oversimplified?
Well, and this is one thing we're hoping to get, and I'm sure we will get comments from the public on. You know, the 2015 plan was 24 pages long. 2016 was 30 pages long. 2017 was 40 pages long. I heard comments that this is a little intimidating. It's not a quick read. But what has not changed, sir, Madam Chair, is all the data, all the work plans, the engineering specifications, the laboratory data, the drinking water data, all that is still out there. It's just that we've put together a more abbreviated summary of that in the form of a PowerPoint that is a quick read. And I know my colleague Dave McCoy likes the 40-page report. I've heard comments that this is a little too intimidating. But for people that want to get geeked out on the science, go to the Hazardous Waste Bureau website. You can download tons and tons of data and be in partial differential heaven.
But Mr. Quinlan, each of these have had a PowerPoint. I think the plan should get, the data in the plan should get bigger as we get along because we should be developing the information. I think, yes, but at the same time we say we have more data and we're simplifying it, we also hear that, well, the data we had, some of it wasn't very good. It had big gaps in it. And we're looking for opportunities to find better data. It seems to me that the plan would be more robust in order to fill those gaps more quickly, to give us quicker data, than for us to simplify the plan only down to the things and say, well, the data's there, but it's some, as we just heard, some was unreliable 2 years later, and others. It just is concerning, I think, that we get to this place where we were making extensive progress, and I acknowledge and appreciate the advances in where we might get to, but on its face, it appears that NMED is allowing the Air Force to take credit and claim that they have made more progress than we have data to support, while allowing a shift in strategy that would be more consistent with more progress than we were able to demonstrate. That's the real concern, and how we might get back to a place where we might continue the work that's being done and the data that we have and filling the gaps from there instead of just prioritizing new science is, I think, the real question about whether this is the right strategy or whether this is perhaps an enhancement to an already existing well-funded or executed strategy. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I believe that CAO Nair has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. McQuillan. I really appreciate the agility that both my colleagues and you show in navigating this technical detail. But just in case there's anyone who sort of may have lost the thread somewhere around here, can you give us just a few plain language statements about the next things that are going to happen and when the public might expect to have things to review and opportunities to participate?
Thank you for that question. We're having a public meeting tomorrow night, At the African American Performing Arts Center, we're going to get a little more into the weeds on some of these fabulous issues that you've raised. And we're going to talk about how LNAPL, the oil, exists in the subsurface. We're going to have other presenters talking about the engineered pilot tests that are going to be put in place this year, like the in situ bioremediation. And there's also going to be a field trip, an open house on, I'm stealing your thunder.
We might delay it because of the budget. So we're looking at probably having it in April because we're not sure if we're going to have a congressional budget on Saturday. We might have a shutdown and we don't want people showing up and we can't let them in. So we're going to schedule as soon as we can in April.
So either Saturday or, well, it sounds like April. Thanks.
We can't Congress do stuff.
You guys should really go see this treatment system. Even if you saw it 2 years ago, it's been like doubled in size. This is the most sophisticated groundwater treatment system in the state of New Mexico, and it's well worth seeing. Look at the commitment the Air Force has made. You know, there are no detectable contaminants coming out of that treatment unit, and it's just fabulously engineered. It's working great, and I want to give you my personal assurance that even though we've come up with a more simplified summary of all the plans, the regulatory work plans are not being simplified. We're deep in the weeds on that, and we go back and forth, and we hold the Air Force's feet to the fire. You know, scientists and engineers don't always agree, and regulators and regulated entities don't always agree, but we try to find the middle ground and move the project forward.
Thank you. Commissioner Hart-Stebbins, you have another question?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So Dennis, at our last meeting, there was a lot of discussion. When you were here last in 2017 in November, there was a lot of talk about a consensus among all the stakeholders about issues that needed to be addressed in the RFI. And there was a response that a lot of that will be taken up in the addendum. But it seems to me there used to be something on your timeline about the addendum, and I don't see that anymore. What is the time frame for, what do you expect in terms of delivery?
Okay, thank you for that question. The RFI is going to be resubmitted to the Environment Department as a phase 1 RFI, and that will cover all the data and the monitoring investigation through the end of December of 2015. We will act upon that, and I've been meeting the technical team at NMED has been looking at the issues. Again, we have some differences of opinion and agreements. We're going to acknowledge some of the data sets that are no good, and not consider them in the analysis. But there's a lot of good data. The phase 2 RFI will be submitted after the additional work is done to do the LNAPL coring, filling the data gaps, the modeling, the plume capture analysis. As you can see on this figure, we've projected the phase 2 RFI, and we're going to break this up into phase 1, phase 2 for future reference. That will probably take us through late 2019 in order to get all that data. It's unfortunate, but because of the rising water table and the data gaps have to be filled, the phase 2 RFI will probably come in around late the fall or the winter of 2019. And at that point, after that's approved, they can proceed to the corrective measures evaluation, which will trigger a very robust public involvement process and ultimately the selection of the final remedy.
Great. Final question, I promise. Risk assessment. So I know that was discussed quite a bit last year. I understand it was submitted to the state in July of 2017. I have also heard that the Department of Health determined that it was flawed, and it is now with NMED. Can you tell me what is happening at the state with that?
Madam Chair, Commissioner, that's on my list of things to do. I inherited a big stack of work plans and other things that were hanging fire when I took over in January. I have not reviewed that risk assessment yet, but it's on my, having gotten through the expansion, the data gap wells and the LNAPL coring, and settling this issue, what we're going to do with this RFI, breaking it into phase 1, phase 2, and we're going to try and settle our differences so it can come in hopefully pre-approved on the phase 1, and we're still going back and forth on that. I will get to the other people have looked at it, I just haven't looked at it, had time yet. and I will give you my personal assurance to do it as fast as we can, but have a solid review on that.
And what does the Department of Health's review, what impact does it have on the Environment Department's review?
Madam Chair, Commissioner, the Department of Health, they have expertise in epidemiology and toxicology. They are the authority in health, and their comments are going to be given great weight in our analysis and review and the comments we send back to the Air Force. And EPA, I think, also has submitted comments on the risk assessment.
Great. And I want to follow up on Councilor Davis's comments. So this has been an issue before this board really since late 2009, early 2010. Certainly in 2011, I believe there was a presentation by the Air Force given to Congress committing to certain deadlines. And I think those deadlines passed in 2014. And I understand there was a lot of, that was Shaw, that was CB&I. There were some issues with that work. I think it would be helpful at some point to the public and to this board to have a new set of deadlines that the NMED might expect of this process. And I understand it's a decades-long process, but for some of these steps, one of the issues in that original contract with Shaw was characterization of the dissolved phase and the LNAPL, and it looks like we still don't have that. And so again, if there's the possibility of putting together some expectations so that we know, even understanding that they might be flexible, I think it would be helpful for all of us to understand where you think we might be able to be seeing some of these outcomes.
Excellent suggestion. Thank you.
appreciate that.
We'll work with the Air Force to put that together.
Thank you. Again, thank you for being here. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, sir. Is there more presentation?
Yes, but I think your questions actually, and Dennis's answers, might have actually taken up most of our presentation. But let me get to the beginning here. So my name is Kate Linus. I'm the senior advisor for the Air Force for this project, as Mr. Carell stated earlier tonight. And if I can maybe have your forbearance, because so many of the topics that Mr. Scott Clark and I were going to discuss tonight on our slides have already been answered by Mr. McQuillan. What I'd like to do is maybe go through these slides and use it as an opportunity to elaborate on answering some of the questions that you, Commissioner Hart-Stebbins, and you, Councilman Davis, have raised earlier this evening. So what we had originally intended to do was specifically address the status of the notice of deficiency. Mr. Clark's going to provide an overview of the data gap wells. I'm going to describe briefly the upgrades to our groundwater treatment system, and briefly discuss our new extraction well, which is well 239, which for those of you who go to Bullhead Park, if you go up San Pedro and you look down Ridgecrest a little bit, it was right down there. Drove by it every day when I went to walk my dogs. And so the notice of deficiency has already been talked about at length, but what I do want you to understand is that we viewed that as a wake-up call. We heard NMED. We realized that we were having some communication issues, which is one of the reasons that we've reorganized ourselves a little bit to make sure that we're all communicating better. And I think what actually happens is when you're working so hard on a project, as all of us do, you kind of get in your silos, and particularly engineers and stuff, we may not be the best communicators in the world. And I think that we kind of migrated away from the communication strategies that were working really well, kind of dug ourselves into our work and saw this as a wake-up call to improve our communication skills. And so what I want you to know is when we got that notice of deficiency in November 16th, pretty much we put the pedal to the metal to address everything. Everyone canceled their Christmas vacations and everything, and we got it done. So we got the Vado Zone coring work plan submitted in 15 December. It was conditionally approved, as Dennis said, on the 23rd of February. We got the data gap well work plan submitted on the 20th of December. It was approved on the 28th of February. We also addressed another point, which was to include the USGS well data in our quarterly reports, which actually goes to one of the questions that you had, Councilman Davis, about with the water table wells and being submerged, how do we know where the plume really is? Well, fortunately, the USGS wells that are now all in one place, and we've always looked at the data, but now they're in one report, they're in our report, we still have a viable well network, Sentinel well network on the tip of the plume between our plume and the Water Authority's wells. So that plus the fact that we are now pumping pretty consistently on now a 4-well system, but until then a 3-well system, that has an effect on helping stop the forward movement of that plume, the hydraulic control, the plume collapse and capture, which Dennis alluded to, as well as we do have a viable well system with those USGS wells in place. So I hope that helps elaborate a little bit on the answer to your question.
Ms. Linus, very quickly, can I just follow up to clarify there, just so I'm clear? Madam Chair, I know we're taking time here. But the USGS wells are essentially a sentinel for us, and they always have been. But those aren't sufficient, in my understanding, for us to capture the data to decide exactly where the plume is. And that's really been the question we haven't been able to get to from the very beginning. We know where it's not, and certainly if it hits our USGS wells, it's coming to the Water Authority wells, which is a problem. So we know where it's not, but we yet still don't have a real sense of exactly what the extent is. Is that fair?
Well, I don't know if I would carry it quite that far. I think that prior to I think it was unexpected on everyone's radar, the significant jump we had in the first half of 2017. By the way, it's kind of flattened out again with the water table, is that we had actually a pretty comprehensive network, and we had a pretty good handle on where that plume is in that paleo channel. And I think last 2016 is when we put those 2 wells kind of in the upper corner to kind of get that extra corner there. So we actually had, I think, a pretty good boundary on that plume in addition to the Sentinel wells. But when you lose your water table screens, and as Scott will describe, some of them are submerged only by this much, some of them are significantly submerged. They still provide data, and our intermediate and deep wells are still viable. It did affect our ability to show both horizontal capture, because we can't get the water table right there. So when you're calculating that plume capture, you've lost that data point. And we also don't have the concentration of ethylene dibromide exactly at the water table because, again, the screens are submerged. And Scott's got a cartoon to kind of help you visualize that if you've never installed a well before and you don't really know what they look like. So I think that's overstating that. I think we did have a very good handle on where the plume is. And the other thing you also have to think about, and actually this next slide here talking about the technical working group for modeling being reconstituted or reinitiated for this effort, when you're pumping like we are, you're creating a zone of hydraulic control around those extraction wells. And so one of the goals of this modeling effort, and the technical working group is going to be working on in April, is we need a model or models that are agile enough for all of the different inputs and variability of inputs that we have here. So for instance, right now you're not pumping the Ridgecrest wells as much because you've got the San Juan Chama diversion water. And so it's as Dennis said, it changed the cone of depression, it's flattened out the gradient a little bit. But what if there's a big fire this year and Albuquerque gets slammed full of ash like Cochiti did? Would you then have to increase your pumping? You know, we have been pumping our extraction wells. We've added a 4th extraction well. What does that effect have on our plume and where it's at and the gradient? So we're looking for a model or models that can help us put these different parameters in place and figure out and try to predict where our weak points are, what we really need to look at. And again, as Dennis mentioned, this is all done according to well-established EPA guidance. Everybody in the country uses this. It's standard, it's been used for decades, and it's an awesome guidance document. So that is where we are headed with this, is either 1 or 2, maybe 2 models that help us resolve this. And then the other part, looking a little bit into the future, is also to support the corrective measures evaluation at that point. And in addition to all the folks that Dennis mentioned that are involved in the technical working group, we've also reached back to the Air Force Civil Engineers Center in San Antonio, and we have access to one of their great modelers that's been involved before, and another really great hydrogeologist are re-engaged in this project as well. So we're not just relying on our contractors, we're actually reaching back to the brains that we have in San Antonio and bringing them back into this effort. And so as Dennis mentioned, at the end of March, we'll submit some preliminary modeling. But the intent is to then bring this as part of the discussion in the technical working group meeting. Everybody submits their data, everything's out there for everyone to review before the meeting, and then we'll sit down and go through, and as Dennis said, it's a true nerd fest. I mean, it's all day long, you're lucky if you get to eat, and start to pound this out. And if we need another meeting or so, we'll do it. And just a couple things, just briefly. You also asked about the difference in the strategic plan. Now, the strategic plan is the state's document. I think it was a wonderful idea when the state initiated doing this a few years ago because, as Dennis said, we could fill this room with notebooks and data, right? No average person can plow through all of that. And the strategic plan, I think, is a really good, accessible way for the public and folks like yourself who have to answer to the public what's going on with this cleanup. But in reality, that's, as Dennis mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, that is not an enforceable document. That is not the permit that we are subject to for this cleanup. I have been doing RCRA cleanup work for over 30 years. I'm that old. This permit is a tough permit. The corrective action process is very rigorous. And so you both expressed concerns about how much we'd rely on monitor and natural attenuation, or what kind of technologies we're really going to use. We're not even at that point of deciding that. We have invested very heavily into interim measures, particularly the groundwater pump and treat, because I think justifiably so. The Water Authority wanted it. Our congressional representatives wanted it, the city wanted it, the community wanted it, and we've invested a significant amount of money, as Dennis said, the most high-tech groundwater treatment plant in the state. That is an interim measure. That is not a final remedy necessarily. The work that we've done with SVE, the soil vapor extraction, remediating between that and the bioslurping and a few other things, has removed about 750,000 gallons of equivalents of fuel from that source area. We've removed tons of soil. Those are all interim measures. These pilots are designed to help us figure out what the next step is. Do they involve some biological and monitored, natural attenuation issues to look at? Yes. Do they involve engineered technologies? Yes. We have a complex site with complex stratigraphy. There isn't something that we could say tomorrow we could go out and say we know for sure this is going to work. Unfortunately, none of us can do that. And we're trying to use data and the best science and the best brains we have available to try pilots, just so that when we get to that corrective measures evaluation, which you have to go through all these different alternatives and rank them based on very stringent criteria to submit to the state, where you're basically saying, we know this won't work, we tried it, we don't think this will work because we can show it on paper it won't work, but boy, this EDB recirculation pilot really has potential, and we want to recommend it for this area because our coring showed this is a hot spot. We think this would be an excellent place to use this technology. So please don't think that the strategic plan, and Dennis said this as well, that's not what drives the regulatory framework for this cleanup. It is our corrective action provisions of our RCRA permit, which, believe me, have significant regulatory teeth. So I just wanted to make that clear, and I'll turn this over to Scott to talk a little bit
Just
about...
a second, please.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Just one moment, please. Commissioner Hart-Stebbins, you have a couple questions.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to ask you, Scott, to kind of roll it along. Thank you.
Madam Chair, thank you. I'll save my questions for after the presentation.
So,
Thank you.
Good
Great.
evening.
So, I was going to speak to the data gaps. And so, as Councilor Davis had said that there were a number of wells that had flooded. It was 53 submerged shallow well screens. And by shallow well screens, what we mean, those are the wells that are literally screened across the water table. So with those wells, we're able to pull water samples from directly on top of the water table. And that's important because that helps us to characterize the plume at the very top. So what's happened is with the rise in the water table, the well screens, the top of the well screens are now submerged. So what used to be a shallow well screen is now what we would consider an intermediate well screen. So what we did is we looked at what the data gaps were with as a result of the rising water table and where the well screens were flooded. And we decided, we're going to have to go back in and stick some more wells in to fill that data gap. And so we'll say it wasn't a data-driven need to replace all of the wells. When we first started, there were a number of redundancies in the wells, and there are still the wells that are around it. So we looked at all of that stuff and decided to do it, of course, in a very holistic fashion. We submitted a work plan to NMED in December. That was approved in February, and we went forward. And so just so to give an idea of how we had screened wells. This is kind of simplified, but we consider shallow, intermediate, and deep. And again, the shallow are the ones that are screened across the water table. So as that water table has risen, the 53 screened wells that were considered shallow wells are now in the intermediate. And that's important for us because we need to not only know the lateral and horizontal extent of the plume, but we also need to know the vertical extent. It's not a pancake. It doesn't sit on top. It's kind of a blob. And so we need to know concentrations at different depths. And so the area where we're really having the data gap is from the top of the well screens that are flooded to the top of the water table. And like Kate had brought up a little earlier, there are some areas where it's a matter of feet, and there are some areas where it's up to 10 or 12 feet where we have that data gap. And we're committed to putting in wells and taking care of that. So just a summary of the new wells are actually a three-pronged approach. 6 of them are just going to be straight up groundwater monitoring wells. We're putting in groundwater monitoring wells screened across the water table, and they will have a lot of screen on them, and they will be able to count for any rise in the groundwater moving forward. So they're future-proof. So we're putting those in. And we had talked too about those El Napo core holes, and that is a coring program. Generally, we're going to be taking cores in the El Napo, kind of like you see in Antarctica or whatever, where they take actual cores, and we'll be pulling those up. We'll doing geological evaluations, chemical evaluation. We'll be looking at any microbial communities that may already be down there. From those cores, any data that we can glean from that, we will do. And when we finish those cores, we're actually going to go back and complete those cores as monitoring wells too. So they will also have well screens, and we'll be able to sample those moving forward. In addition to that, we have 7 and possibly up to 12, depending on the water rate of existing wells that are out there. Before, when we put some wells in, we actually did screen some as dry wells above the groundwater table. And as the water table has risen, those have water in them, and now we're able to sample them. And we also have some deep soil vapor wells that were soil vapor wells down directly above the water table that we use to sample for soil vapor concentrations at depth. And because of the rising water table, those have water in them. And so we're able to sample those. And so what we'll be doing is adding 18 new groundwater monitoring locations to the existing 143 monitoring well network. And so it should say, like, we're still able to sample the wells that are flooded. We're still able to get good data from them. We can still gauge them, which is, getting groundwater elevation data. We're just sampling from a different part, a lower part of the aquifer than we were before. And, we have that data gap to fill in a number of those wells. And my last slide too, I think you guys have a copy of this, and it's a map. I know Dennis's map was a little better. It's roughly the same map, but you can see on the plume, the red dots are the 4 extraction wells, and those are running right now. And the green on here are where the new data gap wells, all 18 of the new wells, which is, again, the coring, the monitoring wells, and the new wells that have come online as a result of the rising water table. And on the top northeast corner too, you'll see the yellow, and those are wells that are currently active, that are still screened across the water table, and those are areas that are directly between the Water Utility Authority wells and the plume. So that's all I had. I don't know if there were any questions or if you wanted to wait till the end. I tried to get through it quickly.
I have one last thing.
Sure.
Okay.
Just one last thing, and I would love to brag on our new treatment system and our expanded treatment system, but I won't for the sake of time. But I do want to spend just about 2 minutes talking about the 4th extraction well, which is the one that's closest to the base. This one is important because, as I think, the issue you were raising, Commissioner Hart-Stebbins, about what is maybe perceived as taking too long to do additional characterization in the source area, we recognize that we have residual contamination in the source area. That's why we're doing the coring. That's why we're looking at various treatment pilots as ways to address that contamination in that source area. But we all know that if you continue to have ethylene dibromide from the source area go into solution and feed that plume that's gone off site, no matter how much you pump on the tip end of it, you're never going to kill it, right? You're just going to be in this perpetual pump and treat mode forever, which you don't want us to be in, and frankly, we don't want to be in. This fourth extraction well is designed to start to cut off the root of that plume. That's why it's placed where it is. The modelers, actually, their original location was in the middle of someone's driveway, and we convinced them to move it over just a hair, thinking nobody would want a drill rig in their driveway. But it was selected with the concurrence of the modelers, and the pumping rate was as well, to say this is the place where we can start to stop that feeding of the ethylene dibromide plume, not affect the overlapping benzene plume that's closer to the base, where actually the bacteria are doing a pretty good job of keeping that stable and keeping it from moving, the bacteria we all love so much, and hit that sweet spot where we can start to cut it off at the base and continue to bring it back from the tip. And so this was a critical well for us to put in, and it went online at 11:30 on February the 5th. I remember seeing the email that it was up and running. So I just wanted to point out that that well is very different, and it's very critical, and I think it addresses a concern that I've heard expressed several times when we've come here.
Sorry, but we need to move on with this.
Okay.
Are there any questions before we ask a representative for the Water Authority to come discuss this with us? Commissioner Hart-Stebbins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Couple of questions, then I'm going to work backwards. Risk assessment, I know you were kind of the lead on that. Again, is the information I have about the Department of Health's assessment accurate?
Frankly, I was not aware that they had done one, ma'am. But
Okay.
that was not communicated to me.
All right. Something you said a little bit earlier indicated that you think there's a consensus on the plume capture, that the way the system is operating right now is actually capturing and drawing in the EDB. I thought that was one of the issues in the notice of deficiency, that there was not consensus and not enough information in RFI to support that.
It was not, I think it was really more a matter of overstatement in terms of the degree of plume capture. I think that we are, it's an unusual RFI report in that usually an RFI report or RCRA facility investigation report is designed to just kind of be like a dragnet thing, just the facts. We came, we saw, we sampled, here's the results. Mm-hmm. We brought in information from the interim measures to try to discuss where we're at, but keep in mind the cutoff point for that was the end of December of 2015.
Great, and I understand that. Let me just get back to my original question. Did you say tonight that there is a consensus among the stakeholders that the pump and treat system that's operating is capturing the plume?
I don't, like we just got done discussing that we have data gaps in terms of horizontal capture and concentrations right now because of the rise in the water table.
Okay.
Before the rise in the water table, I think among, NMED in terms of approving those little corner wells where we put in to finish kind of the general boundary of the plume, both vertically and horizontally, is it perfectly defined? No. Is it defined enough to be able to say, here's where extraction wells need to go and stuff? And then, the wonderful water conservation activities of this community threw us for a loop. I would like to go back to the risk assessment, though, and something you may not be aware of. The risk assessment, again, is sort of an interim risk assessment, because, again, when you've got 16 years of data and you've got a process that goes on this long, you want to do a snapshot risk assessment to say, is there something going on that could adversely affect someone, either on base or off base? So we all agreed, including the state, that this was a good time to do one. If it needs to be updated, particularly based on certain remedies, we will do it at the corrective measures evaluation. We did it in accordance with the guidance that's issued by the state for risk assessments, and we submitted each section of it to most sections of it to the state as we went through it. And we worked very closely on how to structure it and how to discuss it. We fully anticipate comments, but, I do believe that it followed the guidance, yes.
Great. Pump and treat. I think you heard my question to the Environment Department. It seems Intera's capture model was based on those 4 wells pumping 24/7. Mm-hmm. Is it accurate that they're not pumping 24/7?
They are not. We do it as much as we can. Every once in a while, like for instance, when we were hooking up the new piping for the expansion of the treatment system, we had to shut one of the wells off to be able to do that. So those things happen. Do we pump them to the fullest extent that we can? Yes, but just at the stakeholder meeting earlier today that we had, and there's a representative from the Water Authority there as well as everybody else. The plume is getting narrower, at least horizontally. And actually one of our extraction wells is now 233 is outside of the plume boundary because the effect of the pumping and everything has kind of shrank it and made it more narrow. 228 and 234, which are on the tip and the side, are actually doing more of the yeoman's work, and we just turned on 239, so we really don't have any good data from it yet. It hasn't even been operating a month. But what it does show is that, in fact, our influent from all the wells is now below the maximum contaminant limit, which is the enforceable cleanup criteria. So we're actually, pumping water for hydraulic to get the capture zone. Is it fully done? No, absolutely not. That's why this is an interim measure. We're not claiming that. But right now, we're basically treating almost clean water. And we're using the pump and treat for trying to increase that zone of capture and collapse and bring it back.
But, so the Air Force model was never built on 24/7 pumping. Is that accurate?
We have had some capture models that, as Dennis mentioned, were based, once we started getting actual data, we were relying, being kind of engineering, I suppose, in our bent, we're relying rather on models as much as we were looking at actual data. And we agreed with the state that that was inadequate, particularly with losing some of those wells and losing those horizontal data points. So that is why we are working, and Intera and the Water Authority are involved in this technical working group. We are working to develop a model or models that are consistent with EPA guidance and the 6-step capture analysis. And when those models are selected and we all agree, then it's our responsibility to go back and run them, whether it's 1 or 2, and submit those detailed reports to the New Mexico Environment Department once those are selected and consistent with EPA guidance.
Okay. Is the Air Force using a new modeling software, FEFLO?
We haven't selected what we're using really
Okay.
yet.
Is that under consideration?
Yes, absolutely. But there are people, when you get a bunch of modelers in a room, there's various opinions about all those things. Yes.
Sure, I understand that. FEFLO integrates with or talks to other modeling systems?
It can, yeah.
Okay. Is it a proprietary product?
No.
Okay.
And I think that's why we're looking at more than one, potentially more than one model, because this is a complex site. We have complex stratigraphy. We have a bunch of different variables.
Yep, we've heard about that, and I am absolutely understanding of that and the complexity of this project. So last question, since you are the Air Force spokesperson, the coring plan, the bid documents, the bid package that has gone out for that, does that reflect the consensus of the technical working group?
The coring work plan and the work that will be scoped and implemented will be in accordance with the approved work plan that the state approved in February.
Okay, does that include the input from the technical working group?
It does. Does it exactly match everything? No.
Okay.
But it is we have to comply with the approved work plan and the conditions from the state of New Mexico because they are a regulator.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And just before I conclude, I just want to thank Secretary Carell for being here. I don't know if I've ever publicly been able to say this, but I really feel that when you joined this conversation that we saw a real change in how the Air Force was willing to interact with all of the stakeholders, particularly us at the Water Utility Authority. So thank you for that. We continue to appreciate your engagement and just the fact that you're here tonight. So thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, everyone. We would like to hear from, I think there are a few questions from, for the Water Authority. Rick, if you'd like to come down. And perhaps if you want to make a statement, that's fine with us. And then we have a couple quick questions for you, and then we will proceed. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have sent out a memo with our comments today on the Strategic Plan 2018 from NMED. And listening tonight, I mean, they've answered a lot of questions. We still leave me with some questions I have, though, for NMED on that. First of all, there was a removal of pump and treat from, or plume collapse from the sort of initial page, and that was usually a priority site. So that to us was very clear. It did not look like 2018 was a year of full pump and treat, or it opened itself up to other options, such as the natural attenuation, which they did speak to. The hydrolysis that they were talking about is something we haven't seen evidence, and our review of the RFI document by Intera showed that we did not agree that it was occurring. And the way we understand, if it was happening at any significant rate in the aquifer, that the plume actually probably wouldn't be there, at least stretching as long as it is into the aquifer. So that's one of our main concerns. But I could go on, but I'll open myself to other questions.
Thank you. Councilor Pena, did you have some questions? No. Okay. Are there any questions for Rick? Thank you, and thanks
Thank you very
for
much.
helping us through this.
Thank you.
Thank you. That does conclude our water report, but since we're already on the other business section, Ms. Juhas, would you like to come give us a drought update before we move along with the regular agenda? Thank you.
Not quite sure where my slide is. It's the very last. There we go. Madam Chair, members of the board, 73% of the state is in severe drought, and extreme drought conditions have increased across the northern part of the state since last month. These conditions are expected to continue through June, but they should ease in July and August, which might allow us to have a normal monsoon season. And on the positive side, if you look over at the right side of this slide, our customers are doing a great job keeping their water use under control. Our customers have only used 30 million gallons more than last year. Now, 30 million might sound like a whole lot, but that actually equates to less than 1/4 of a gallon per person per day. And that is in the face of having received far less moisture this year. Precipitation from January to March 21st of 2017 was 1.39 inches, and this year it was just 0.63. So they've had a modest increase in water use in response to the drought. So our customers are doing just what we've been working with them for 20 years to get them to do. Respond appropriately to weather conditions, but not over water in response to drought. And with that good news, I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Juhas. Are there any questions? Thank you very much for the report. So let's get back on the agenda, which would be the approval of the minutes. I make a motion to approve the February 28th, 2018 minutes. Second. There's a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes. Yes. Opposed? Motion carries. There are no proclamations and awards. However, I believe there's probably public comment. So how many do we have signed up this evening? Six. So I'm going to give each person 3 minutes to speak with a warning at 2.5. If you'll please wrap it up at 2.5 minutes. Would you call the first speaker?
Dave McCoy, followed by Lara Dale.
Good evening. I'm Dave McCoy of Citizen Action, New Mexico. I appreciate the comments and the concerns that were expressed. They were quite accurate and to the point. So I want to add a few things. I want to talk just a little about pump and treat. This is a technology that's for every gram of EDB that you remove, you're removing about somewhere between around 3.8 million gallons of water. For 350 million gallons, they've removed about 110 grams of EDB. That's a few teaspoons. So you're looking at millions of grams of EDB potentially out there in the aquifer. And if you divide 110 grams into even 100,000 grams, you're at 1,000 years using pump and treat technology. So this certainly isn't a solution to the problem. Our concern is, one, there's no RFI in place. It was done back in 2014. It was late then. Then it's late now again, and now it's being extended. And we had a risk assessment plan that was premised on the RFI, which had lots of data gaps. So how do you have an accurate risk assessment based on an inaccurate RFI? I'm going to be jumping around a little, I guess, tonight. But one of the things with respect to public participation and anybody's participation is the New Mexico Environment Department website. It's not searchable. You go in, you want to search through 10 years of documents, try putting in a word, find it. You know, you won't find it. It doesn't come up because it's not searchable. That website needs to be made searchable, and when they post documents, they need to be searchable too. And so that's a concern. There's no organization chart for all these different agencies that are involved and who's doing what and when is it being done. And I've talked before about the lack of the public to attend technical meetings. We think that's a problem still. We think the plan ignores EDB and the contaminant health dangers that should be expressed. Critical gaps remain that have to be
Sorry,
examined
Mr. McCoy.
by the 2018
Mr. McCoy,
strategy
thank you.
plan.
Sorry, but we're running a tight schedule tonight. Thank you, Mr. McCoy. Next speaker.
Dale Lara, followed by Cody Slama.
Good evening.
My name is Laura Dale. I'm a free speech advocate. How this ties into the water issues is I am here because we are starting to issue the RFP for the public access channels. It has previously been operated by an entity that masquerades as a nonprofit and is in fact a for-profit agency, has not put out more than 10 hours of public access programming. And one of the reasons I'm so involved in this and the way it ties into the water is the irony is that public access started as some activists in Canada who were doing filming about water contamination. And they saw these cables being laid in the land and saw that this community was not being listened to, so they made a bargain with the cable companies. You give us some bandwidth so we can create some media, so we can get some attention to these issues, and we'll let you lay the cables. And so that did so well in Canada, they even won the water rights issue, that it traveled to New York and then it took over the country. So cable access, public access started as a water rights issue, a water contamination rights issue. We've got the same thing going on here, and the big irony of that plume, the reason you even know about it is because of some very devoted public activists here in New Mexico who were involved with the public access station when Kirtland Air Force Base had its head in the absolute sand, was refusing to even admit there was a plume, and some public advocates here in the state who were military people, got on their little channel with public access and repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly talked about the plume until finally you folks listened, and I don't mean you here, I just mean the government and the agencies. So public access is a fundamental part of the canary in the coal mine, because when accidents like this happen, it's the public's health that hits first. You start seeing the birth rates go down, or you start seeing the cancer rates go up, or whatever. So the public is always the one who first experiences the impact of this. And when you take away their voice from public access, you've destroyed their ability to explain what is happening to them and to get people like you to take it seriously. Kirtland Air Force Base would have literally buried that for as long as possible had it not been for public access in New Mexico, constantly putting programs and constantly going to meetings and constantly talking about the health consequences that were happening. So it is time to get back a robust, powerful, community-based public access channel away from the contractor who has turned away pretty much every producer that used to be on the previous contract, and let's get back to the canary in the coal mine being able to tell the community, this is what's happening to us, this is what's hurting us, this is why our children can't read, this is why this and that. This is a viable part of how you as the governing bodies stay on top of these issues before they become the plume that you can't contain and that you don't know where it is. And if people had listened to them back then, this would not be the utter mess that it is right now. So please, take this RFP process very seriously. Let's get the best person in the position, and let's get our voices back on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cody, Cody, followed by Mike Neese.
Hello, my name is Cody Slama. I'm with Albuquerque Water Groups, and I'm here tonight because I'm very concerned that this plume isn't being cleaned up as fast as it should be, and I'm concerned that it may never be cleaned up. The extraction wells have only pulled out 87 grams of EDB, ethylene dibromide, whenever there's much, much more. So this is the very minimal amount. And this new plan seems to be having a lot to do with monitoring wells. And that's another one of my concerns, is that the monitoring wells that they have now aren't calculating whether the water is contaminated or not. And that's very concerning to me because I live very close to the plume, and I want to know whether my water is safe to drink, to use for showering, and so going along in the future, I want to know what is the plan and what is the strategy for when the cleanup fails, because it looks to me like, and I was not convinced tonight, and I've been to other public meetings, and I am not convinced at all that this cleanup is going well. And I want to know what is the plan whenever it fails, and how is the public going to be informed? There's quarterly meetings, but are you going to wait a few months to tell the public before the regular public meetings come up? So yeah, that's really what I came up here tonight for, is to ask that question and to request that we don't have anything that happened like in Flint, Michigan a few years ago, where the public was not informed. And if this contamination is ever in our drinking water, we need to know right away, because this is an environmental justice issue and it needs to be dealt with. And I would ask that everyone in this room and everyone else who has a say in how this is dealt with, that it is dealt with. And that, yeah, thank you.
Mike Neese, followed by Elaine Hubbard.
Madam Chair, members of the board, my name is Mike Neese. I appreciate you allowing us to hear that presentation tonight prior to public comment. There were a couple things I'd like to mention regarding that. One of the speakers mentioned that what if there was a forest fire and the Albuquerque Lake was closed because of all the debris coming from the fire. What I'd like to talk to you about a little bit tonight is about the fact that the Water Protection Advisory Board in 2017 issued an advisory letter requesting that you look into oil and gas ordinances for the city and the county. They're about to reissue that letter, and I think that probably in the next 2 weeks you will have a new and improved letter, because nobody was listening to it the first time. One of the things that changed their minds was a presentation by a geologist by the name of Don Phillips. And Mr. Phillips has a very compelling presentation going to be given right here in this room on April 3rd at 6:30. So I recommend, and I hope that you will all watch and attend that presentation, because the Albuquerque Basin It does need to be protected. We do need to be paying attention to other potential pollution hazards, not just the Kirtland spill. And so, by the way, the presentation on the 3rd at 6:30 is sponsored by Commissioner Hart-Stebbins and Councilor Davis. So please attend, and let's not let any further, being proactive is more important than cleanup, and hopefully Bernalillo County never has to go through what we're going through with the Kirtland spill again.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Neese, I want to thank you for your interest in this, your engagement, your ongoing engagement. I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that we got that letter and didn't listen.
No.
I think you're aware of the work that has been done subsequent to the Water Protection Advisory Board's letter. So again, just want to make sure that you're clear. We did read it. We have responded. So, and can look forward to continuing to
I
work
am
with
clear
you.
on that, Commissioner, and I'm sorry that I might have sounded like you didn't do anything.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Elaine Hubbard, followed by Santiago Maestas.
Madam Chair, Santiago had to leave, so he asked me to say a few words, if I might, at the end of my comments. My name is Elaine Hubbard. Tomorrow is World Water Day. The theme is "The Answer is in Nature," so I hope that you will all celebrate. I'm here to talk about 3 action items. The first is on the drought management strategy, which I would suggest be pulled out from the conservation plan. It's section 7 of the resolution tonight. And that is because I think something that Commissioner Hart-Stebbins raised last month about the drought, the groundwater pumping goal is one of 2 factors that is raised in that plan, and it should probably be tied with the groundwater management plan rather than the conservation plan. You'll use conservation measures if a drought is ever mentioned. But the drought pumping goal increases if there's a less water in the river, because it is actually set because of the Fish and Wildlife Service annual operating plan rather than as part of a drought. So it increases pumping. We don't want to increase pumping. We are already paying back for the prior pumping. In fact, the depletions that are now in the river are probably twice what the pumping is right now because of past pumping. You don't want to add to those. We don't have a bank account. We didn't put water into it. We are paying more like a line of credit. So every time we take water out, we actually have to pay for that water. The second item that I want to mention, so the first item is pull out the drought management strategy. The second item that I'd like to just suggest is that in the goals and objectives, since the budget ordinance says have a process which encourages active community participation, have a workshop on the goals and objectives. Last night kicked off the county's 2015-2018 cycle of goals and objectives for their CIP program. I would suggest something similar with the utility to make sure that it is connected and meshes with the city and county. And so there are several specific things that I would suggest with the goals and objectives that have been suggested, and I will submit those in letter form because there's not enough time. But one of the goals for this year was to update the water supply charge, and as far as I understand, that has not been yet done. It will look at the expansion of the no net expense. The water supply charge is a part of the no net expense calculation. And so, as Mr. Maestas was going to mention, tonight's R189, which is authorizing amendment to the 2000 agreement with Western Water Land Holdings, relies in part on the water supply charge as it currently exists. Since we know it's being changed, the request is to have a moratorium on anything that is asking for the current water supply charge until that charge is updated. And Mr. Maestas had the letters from Suntech to the Water Utility Authority about the water supply charge. to hand out as part of his presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if I might.
Also, before we go to the next speaker, just realize that Colonel Gibbs and Colonel Hartnett are still here. We want to thank them for all the help they've given us and for dealing with this, and also for your staff being here and listening to what we have to say. Thank you.
So that was Mr. Maestas' presentation.
Got it. Thank you. We're done. Okay, thank you. That is the end of public comment. The next scheduled meeting will be April 18th, 2018 at 5 p.m. here in the Vincent E. Griego Chambers. Next item of business is the introduction of first reading of legislation. Mr. Roth.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. In front of you today are the goals and objectives for fiscal year 19. Just as a correction on the agenda, this is for fiscal year 19. The resolution is correct. We'll fix the title for the resolution for the next agenda. The goals and objectives are part of the utility strategic planning budgeting improvement process. You can see the goals and objectives on top of this diagram. As a part of the goals and objectives, we do a lot of benchmarking, measuring our performance year to year. We also benchmark our performance against other high-performing utilities to look at performance gaps. We also look in terms of conducting assessments to look at best practice components based on effective utility management. All this is used to help drive the budget, which will be introduced at the April meeting. We balance this quantitative information with input from our customers. They weigh in on how they think we're doing. We do this through customer opinion surveys every 2 years, input from our advisory committees on a monthly basis, and then customer conversations that occur 4 times a year. And we also use this information as a part of our employee expectation process in terms of the performance improvements. All this to help fulfill the mission of our utility. This slide shows the 5 goal areas. Within each goal, we have guiding goal statements. This is the what we want to achieve, the desired outcome in each goal area over the long term. And we measure our performance in each goal area by these key performance indicators. These come out from the American Water Works Association. So we measure our performance year to year on these key performance indicators, but also benchmark our performance against other high-performing utilities. Through the benchmarking process, best practice assessments, and customer input, we identify performance gaps through in terms of operations and service delivery. And we address those performance gaps through the budget process by allocating and prioritizing resources. And we develop these improvement processes in order to become more efficient and effective in our operations and service delivery. And this is delivered through the one-year objectives. These objectives are part of our continuous performance improvement process. So these objectives also, some of these objectives become part of the employee expectations so that we can really drive performance throughout the organization and communicate our performance gaps and why we need to address these performance gaps. There's 52 objectives in these goal areas, and we'll highlight some of the major objectives by these different goal areas. In the water supply and operations goal, we want to continue our work in the leak detection program, identifying leaks before they surface, because we don't want catastrophic leaks, which often costs more money to fix. In the aquifer storage and recovery, we want to begin testing of the large-scale aquifer storage recovery project, which is underway at the drinking water plant, and complete the operation plan for that project, but also evaluate what is the next ASR project going into the future. We want to continue our progress in terms of planned maintenance activities. We want to conduct more planned maintenance rather than corrective maintenance. Over time, we have targets for our surface and groundwater facilities. This year, we started water conservation events in terms of meeting with the auditors, landscapers, property managers, and then generally open houses. And we want to continue these events through fiscal year 19. And lastly, in this goal area, we want to continue our partnership with our Safe Water program, where we learn about operation optimization to become more efficient in our service delivery to our customers. And also, as a key objective, implementation of the Water 2120 plan, which was adopted in 2016. In the wastewater collection operations goal, we have several targets around sewer cleaning and televising, and this is used to help reduce sanitary sewer overflows. We, as you saw in the presentation last year during the budget process, we're about halfway done in terms of the reclamation rehabilitation plan. This includes a major overhaul of rehabilitation of major facilities at our wastewater treatment plant. Similar to the water plant, we want to increase our plant maintenance, so we have targets related to plant maintenance activities at our wastewater treatment plant. And also to continue as a part of that process of cleaning our wastewater, we want to turn those biosolids into composting and be able to sell that composting to vendors throughout Albuquerque and throughout the state. In the customer service goal, we have several metrics related to our call center operations. We started this several years ago, and so we have several targets in order to continue customer satisfaction when our customers contact the Water Authority. We have a lot of aging meters, and we want to update that through our automated meter infrastructure program by replacing these old meters with smart meters to help continue improving our revenue and support our conservation efforts. We want to continue with our customer conversation meetings. This is where we have meetings with our customers 4 times a year, talking about important issues facing the utility. We do this through focus group meetings, roundtable discussions, and very interactive and engaging activities with our customers. In the business planning and management goal, we have a target of expending $55 million for water and wastewater rehabilitation and replacement. We also want to continue our work on the next phase of construction for the Los Padillas Water Project. Protecting our assets from cyber attacks through the using guidelines, standards, and best practices from the National Cybersecurity Framework. Later this year, we'll be conducting our biannual rate study. We'll be involving the Technical Customer Advisory Committee in this rate evaluation, and you can expect some recommendations from the committee in spring of 2019. We completed a major upgrade to our Maximo system. This is our comprehensive asset management system or computer management and maintenance system. This is used to make better decisions about our assets in terms of full life cycle costing. And we use this since we will continue to do some updates to the system in the next fiscal year, looking at fleet management and condition monitoring, as well as life cycle accounting. And lastly, with the Water Lab certification, we're preparing for that audit from the state, as well as the accreditation assessment as well. And in the last goal of organization development, we want to continue our work with our knowledge management strategy. We have many employees who are leaving our organization, and we want to make sure that we transfer their knowledge, their experience to the employees who are succeeding them over time. Something that's very popular with our employees is the wellness program. We have several challenges that we have set up with our employees, but this wellness program also looks at focusing on nutrition, physical activity, weight loss, disease, and injury prevention as well. And lastly, this year we started a new program, Employee Connections, where we have focus group meetings with our employees, discussing important issues, challenges facing our utility. And we identify many of these areas through our employee surveys, and we will continue to identify these issues through this survey, but from the outcome from these meetings, we're going to be implementing or integrating some of these changes through our training program. Overall, these are the goals and objectives for fiscal year 19. Many of these objectives are very technical in nature, but they're used to improve our efficiency and effectiveness in operations and service delivery, and are a big component of our continuous performance improvement program. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. And again, this is a first reading, an introduction, but if we have any questions, Mr. Roth is available. Yes, Ms. Neer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question with regard to public input into the goals and objectives. Could that sort of conversation happen at the customer conversations that the water utility holds regularly?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Member Nair. Yes, those customer conversations look at different issues and challenges that the utility is facing. They are very related to the goals and objectives. And therefore, our customers weigh in on really the goals and objectives on an annual basis, 4 times a year.
Any more questions? Thank you, Mr. Roth. Moving right along to the consent agenda. I would make a motion to approve the consent agenda. There's a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes. Yes, motion carries. We have a few approvals items this evening. The first one is 018-1, amending the water waste ordinance. Mr. Bustos, would you like to talk about this?
Madam Chair, members of the board, since we made a presentation on this last time, if it's pleasing to you, we'll just stand for questions on this.
Thank you. Are there any
move
questions?
approval.
There's a motion and a second for approval. All those in favor say yes. Yes, motion carries. Thank you. Very well done.
Thank you very much.
Second is item B, 018-2, authorizing the execution and delivery of a loan and subsidy agreement by and between the Albuquerque Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority and the New Mexico Finance for the Advanced Metering Infrastructure. Does anyone have any questions? In that case, I would move approval.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes.
Yes.
Yes, motion carries. Item C is R18-7, confirming approval of the execution and delivery of a loan and subsidy agreement by and between the Albuquerque Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority and the New Mexico Finance Authority. Move approval.
Second.
Any questions? All those in favor say yes. Yes, motion carries. And item D is R18-8, approving the update to the Water Conservation Plan. I would move approval. Are there any questions?
Second.
There's a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes. Yes, motion carries. Last item on the agenda is R18-9, authorizing amendment to 2007 agreement with Western Albuquerque Land Holdings for the Antelope site. Move approval. Are there any questions? Ms. Neer.
Madam Chair, I just have a question to clarify the audience's question earlier. The language about being subject to current utility expansion and water charges on page 1, section 2, line 25. Does that mean that we're locking in the water charges at this moment, or that they'll be the sort of then current charges?
Madam Chair, Member Nair, that's correct. It would be the then water supply charge or UECs at that time. I think that language is intended to capture future changes to those charges.
Thank you. Any more questions? There's been a motion and a second for R18-9. All those in favor say yes. Yes, motion carries. With that, thank you all for being here this evening, and the meeting is adjourned.